Billionaire CEO mocks the waitress in Japanese, then freezes when she replies fluently. What if the most arrogant moment of your life became the gateway to discovering something beautiful you never knew existed? In a gleaming Manhattan restaurant where crystal glasses caught the afternoon light like scattered diamonds, 42-year-old business mogul Harrison Blake sat across from his closest associates, celebrating another billion-dollar acquisition. His empire stretched from tech startups to real estate, and his reputation for ruthless efficiency preceded him everywhere. But today, something would crack that polished exterior in a way no boardroom battle ever could. The restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of the wealthy and influential, silverware clinking against fine china, while servers moved gracefully between tables like dancers in an expensive ballet. Harrison barely noticed these details, until a 36-year-old waitress named Keiko approached their table. Her gentle smile and professional demeanor would soon become the center of a moment that would echo through his thoughts for years to come. Where are you watching from tonight, and have you ever witnessed a single moment completely change someone's perspective? Harrison Blake had built his fortune on reading people quickly and exploiting their weaknesses without hesitation. His steel-gray eyes had intimidated CEOs twice his age, and his sharp tongue had closed deals that others deemed impossible. Today's lunch was meant to celebrate the acquisition of a struggling electronics company, another feather in his already overcrowded cap of victories. Gentlemen, to another successful hunt. Harrison raised his crystal tumbler, his voice carrying the confident tone of a man who'd never known real failure. His associates, Richard and Anthony, clinked their glasses with practiced enthusiasm, though something in their expressions suggested they were growing weary of Harrison's increasingly harsh business tactics. Keiko had been working at Celestial Heights for 3 years, saving every penny for her mother's medical treatments back in Kyoto. She'd chosen this upscale restaurant because the tips were generous, and she'd learned to navigate the egos of wealthy diners with grace and patience. Her English was perfect, honed through years of study, but she kept her background private, preferring to let her work speak for itself. As she approached Harrison's table with their appetizers, she couldn't help but overhear fragments of their conversation about laying off hundreds of workers from the newly acquired company. Her heart sank. She knew what unemployment meant for families, having watched her own father struggle through similar circumstances years ago. "Your salmon tartare, sir," she said softly, placing the delicate dish before Harrison with practiced elegance. Her hands were steady despite the weight of what she'd overheard. Harrison barely glanced up, his attention fixed on the documents spread across the table. "Richard, these severance packages are still too generous. We can cut them by 40% and still remain within legal boundaries." Keiko's step faltered slightly as she served the remaining dishes. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they were real people with mortgages, children, dreams that would be shattered by morning. She'd seen this devastation before, and it never got easier to witness such casual disregard for human suffering. As she turned to leave, Harrison's voice rose slightly, discussing the dead weight they'd be eliminating. The callousness in his tone made something stir inside Keiko, a memory of her father's dignity even in his darkest hour, and her mother's quiet strength through impossible circumstances. 20 minutes later, Keiko returned to refill their water glasses, hoping the conversation had shifted to lighter topics. Instead, Harrison was in full display of his arrogance, regaling his associates with stories of his latest conquests in the business world. "The beauty of this acquisition," Harrison continued, cutting into his filet mignon with surgical precision, "is that these people actually thought their company had value. They fought so hard to keep their little family business intact." He chuckled coldly. "Sentiment is expensive, and I don't deal in expensive emotions." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Harrison, some of these employees have been with the company for decades. Maybe we could." "Could what?" "Run a charity." Harrison's voice sharpened. "This is exactly why I succeed where others fail. I don't get clouded by irrelevant emotional attachments to people who can't adapt to reality." Keiko's hands trembled slightly as she poured water into Harrison's glass. She thought of Mrs. Chen, a regular customer who'd lost her job last month and couldn't afford to eat here anymore. She thought of the janitor at her apartment building who worked 3 jobs to support his grandchildren. Harrison noticed her slight hesitation and seized the moment to demonstrate his worldly sophistication to his companions. Switching to Japanese, he began speaking in what he believed was a perfect accent, though his pronunciation was stilted and clearly unpracticed. Kono jokyu wa totemo noro I desu. Kanojo wa watashitachi no jiken o muda ni shitemasu, he said with a smirk, telling his associates that, this waitress is very slow and wasting our time. He continued in Japanese, making disparaging comments about service workers and their lack of intelligence, his voice dripping with condescension. Anthony laughed nervously, not understanding the words but recognizing the mocking tone. Richard looked away, clearly uncomfortable with his business partner's behavior. Keiko stood frozen beside their table, the water pitcher growing heavy in her hands. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was a man who saw himself as sophisticated and worldly, using a language he barely understood to mock someone whose story he knew nothing about. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Dignity is something no one can take from you unless you give it away yourself. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath as Keiko made a decision that would change everything. What would you do in her position? Keiko's mind raced through a dozen possible responses, each carrying different consequences. She could ignore the insult and walk away, protecting her job but swallowing her pride. She could report it to management, though she knew wealthy customers rarely faced consequences for their behavior. Or she could do something that might cost her everything but preserve the dignity her grandmother had taught her to cherish. The weight of her mother's medical bills pressed against her conscience. This job wasn't just income, it was hope, a bridge between their family's current struggles and a better future. But standing there, listening to Harrison's cruel words delivered in her native tongue, she realized some prices were too high to pay. "Harrison-san," she said softly, her voice carrying a musical quality that made him look up for the first time that evening. "Anata no nihongo wa totemo kirai desu ga, sukashi makigai taimasu." The blood drained from Harrison's face as Keiko continued in flawless Japanese, her tone respectful but firm. "Your Japanese is quite beautiful, but slightly mistaken. I believe you meant to say something kinder about your server." The silence that followed was deafening. Anthony's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Richard's eyes widened as he watched his confident business partner transform into a statue of shock and embarrassment. Keiko's heart pounded, but she continued with quiet grace. "I studied linguistics at Tokyo University before moving here to support my family. I understand that sometimes we say things in foreign languages thinking no one will understand, but words carry weight in any tongue." Harrison's mouth opened and closed without sound. For the first time in years, the man who commanded billion-dollar deals found himself completely speechless. The woman he dismissed as just a waitress had just revealed a depth of education and sophistication that made his own behavior seem grotesquely small. "My apologies," Keiko continued in English, her voice maintaining its professional warmth despite the tension. "Would you like me to get you anything else this evening?" The question hung in the air like a bridge. She was offering him a chance to respond with grace, to show the character he claimed to possess in boardrooms around the world. Richard leaned forward, fascination replacing his discomfort. "You studied at Tokyo University? Have you ever faced a moment where someone underestimated you completely? Let us know in the comments." Harrison remained frozen, his carefully constructed world of superiority crumbling around him as he stared into the intelligent eyes of a woman whose story he'd never bothered to learn. The moment stretched like eternity before Harrison finally found his voice, though it came out smaller and less certain than he'd ever allowed it to be in public. I owe you an apology." The words felt foreign on his tongue, unfamiliar after years of never having to account for his actions to anyone he considered beneath him. Keiko nodded gracefully. "We all make mistakes, Harrison-san. What matters is what we learn from them." Something in her tone, not condescending, not angry, but genuinely forgiving, cracked something open inside Harrison's chest. Here was a woman he'd insulted in what he thought was a private language, and she was responding with more dignity than he'd shown in years. "Tell me," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. About Tokyo University. What did you study? For the first time that evening, Keiko's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing a glimpse of the brilliant woman beneath. International Relations and Cultural Psychology. I wrote my thesis on how language barriers create artificial divisions between people who actually share the same fundamental hopes and fears. Richard whistled softly. That's incredibly relevant to our business, actually. We're always struggling with cultural integration in our international acquisitions. Harrison felt the irony hit him like a physical blow. Here he was, about to destroy hundreds of jobs without considering the human cost, while the woman serving his dinner possessed expertise that could have made his business practices more humane and potentially more profitable. Keiko, he said, surprising himself by using her name for the first time, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. He took a shaky breath. When you heard us talking about the layoffs earlier, what did you think? She studied his face for a moment, perhaps searching for sincerity behind his usual business facade. I thought about my father, she said finally. He lost his job when I was 16. The company said the same things, that it was just business, that emotions couldn't cloud practical decisions. But they never saw him sitting at our kitchen table at 3 in the morning, wondering how he'd failed his family. The restaurant seemed to disappear around them as Harrison absorbed the weight of her words. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. What happened to him? Harrison asked, though he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer that might shatter his remaining justifications. Keiko's eyes softened with memory. He found another job eventually, but something in him had changed. The man who used to sing while making breakfast became quieter, more careful with his words and dreams. He never quite recovered that easy confidence he'd once carried. She paused, then added gently, but he taught me that dignity isn't about what others give you, it's about what you choose to give others. Harrison sat in stunned silence, processing how profoundly this encounter was reshaping his understanding of success and worth. The acquisition papers spread across their table suddenly looked different, not like trophies of victory, but like documents that would tear apart real families, real dreams. Richard, Anthony, Harrison said finally, his voice steadier now but carrying a weight it had never held before. We're going to restructure this deal. His associates exchanged surprised glances. I want to meet with their senior staff before we make any personnel decisions. And I want Keiko to consult with us on cultural integration strategies. Keiko blinked in surprise. I'm honored, but I'm just a waitress trying to pay my mother's medical bills. No, Harrison said firmly, standing from his chair with newfound purpose. You're exactly what our company needs, someone who understands that business isn't just about profit margins, but about the human beings behind every decision. He pulled out his business card and wrote something on the back. This is my direct number. Call me tomorrow, and we'll discuss a position that actually uses your education and pays what you're worth. For the first time that evening, Keiko's composure cracked slightly, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. Why? After what happened? Because, Harrison said, his voice carrying a humility that would have been impossible an hour earlier, you just taught me something no business school ever could. You showed me that real strength isn't about having power over others, it's about lifting them up when you have the choice to tear them down. As they prepared to leave, Harrison left a tip that was more than Keiko usually made in a month, but the money felt secondary to the transformation she'd witnessed. The arrogant man who'd mocked her in Japanese was walking out with his shoulders less rigid, his expression more thoughtful than triumphant. 3 months later, Harrison's company would become known for its revolutionary approach to acquisitions, preserving jobs while increasing efficiency through cultural understanding and employee dignity. And Keiko, now heading their new department of cultural integration, would often think about her grandmother's wisdom. Sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as ordinary moments of choosing kindness over cruelty. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovering that even the hardest hearts can learn to see beyond themselves.